So, there are two ideas that need to be introduced in order for the answer to make sense. And these are not difficult ideas. I mean, honestly, the only people who have trouble understanding what I'm about to tell you are apparently other Nobel Prize winners. But regular people seem to kind of follow this, because it does make sense, it's intuitive. So the two things are this. Number one, the way the Austrian school looks at how things are produced. The way the Austrians look at how things are produced is things are produced in a series of stages. We have higher order stages and lower order stages. The lowest order stage is the finished good. It is the bagel that's in your hand. That's the lowest order stage, when that bagel is staring at you in a bakery. But the highest order stage is when the farmer is engaged in his harvest. That's a very high order stage, because there's nothing that farmer is bringing in that you're going to eat right now, and it's not going to be a bagel at that point. It has to go through various processing, it has to be transported, it has to be marketed, there has to be a wholesaler involved, the wholesaler ships it to the retailers. There are all these different stages that the various goods that come together to produce a bagel have to pass through before it yields ultimately a bagel. So we go from, so in other words, the higher order stages of production are the stages that are the farthest removed from a finished consumer good. So, like, well, farming would be one, but mining would be one. Research and development would be one. Because research and development, like we consumers, we don't consume research and development services. We consume the fruits of those services. We consume the products that they give rise to. But we don't consume research and development directly. So that's, again, a high order stage of production. That could be 10 years away from a consumer, but it could be 20 years. Who knows? But these things are remote. And then construction, you move down a little bit. Manufacturing, construction gets a little bit lower order stage, and then you got a wholesaling stage. You got all different. You got a bunch of stages in between, and then ultimately it yields you your finished consumer good, whether it's a pair of jeans or a watch or a hat or whatever. But they all have to go through these series of time-consuming stages. Now, I think when we hear it described this way, very few people will say that's an unrealistic way of looking at how things are produced. Because, of course, that is how things are produced. Like, that is obviously how they happen. Watches are not fully formed any more than bagels are from the beginning. So this is indeed how things are created. But secondly, the other concept introduced, and then it all comes together. The other concept is interest rates. Now, I think interest rates, that is so technical, I want to commit an atrocity. No, just hang on with me now. Interest rates, not so bad. It's just basically this. When the general public saves more money, this puts downward pressure on interest rates. This is the insight we want to remember. Why would that be? I would just point out, why would that be the case? Well, if we save our money, we put it in the banks, this puts downward pressure on interest rates because the banks now have more to lend. And now that they have more to lend, in effect, the price of borrowing, if we want to put it crudely, is going to become lower. It's like a supply and demand thing. We've got a huge supply of loanable funds now, so the price of them is going to be cheaper. The interest rate is going to be lower. Okay, that's fine. Now, that is the time when businesses are going to want to engage in most of their long-term production. If you're going to engage in a project that isn't going to turn a profit for you for 5 years, let's say, and you've got to borrow money to start this project, and the interest rate is 15%, you might think twice about that. Because you think, oh gosh, over the course of 5 years, or imagine a 10-year project, think of that compound interest. Every month you're making out that check, and you know that 3/4 of it is going to pay the interest, and you just hate yourself. And, But, what if you have a 5 or 10-year project and suddenly interest rates are 3%? Well, now that makes a huge difference in the monthly payments that you're going to make on that particular loan. So the longer the term of the project is, the more sensitive it is to movements in interest rates. Because the larger those interest payments get, the longer you're borrowing. And so interest is a very, very substantial part of your expenses. So if the interest rate comes down, it's not nearly as a substantial part of your expenses. So anything that's geared toward the long term is going to be stimulated by lower interest rates. Okay, that's all. Those are the only fundamental concepts we need to introduce. And now we basically get to it. This is basically what Mises was arguing from the beginning from his book, Theory of Money and Credit in 1912. And he elaborated this over the course of his career for the next 6 decades. And basically it's like this. He says, let's imagine 2 different scenarios. We'll imagine a good scenario and, yes indeed, a bad scenario. So a good scenario would be this. The general public saves money. This pushes interest rates down. Good, we've seen this so far. Businesses now engage in long-term production projects. Okay, we already saw that that's going to happen. Why is it good that businesses are engaged in long-term production projects right now? Because think of what's actually happening in the economy when you and I save. What's actually happening? Two things are basically happening. We're saying, number one, we are saying to the world, I am not going to blow every cent of my paycheck right away. I am saving some of my money for the future. I'm going to defer my purchases for the future. That's the first thing we're saying. Well, that's good because what are businesses engaged in? Production for the future. Okay, we're going to spend in the future, so there's a coordination. But secondly, notice what happens if you and I save more. It means we're not buying as many consumer goods as before. We're not buying as many hats or iPods or books or whatever else, watches, anything else. We're not buying as many of those things, so what happens to those industries? Well, they're going to start to shrink. I mean, obviously, if nobody's buying hats or fewer hats are being sold, you don't need as many hat manufacturers. So the hat manufacturers are going to shrink. And if you don't need as many hats produced, you don't need as many of the inputs that go into hat making. And this goes for any other consumer good that people are buying less of. You don't need as many retail outlets, you don't need as many wholesalers, you don't need as much steel going into the production of that thing, you don't need as much lumber, you don't need as much trucking service, you don't need as many laborers. So what happens is that when we save, we're not consuming as much, so the consumer goods industries are going to contract relatively. And that means that all of a sudden there are going to be resources that are available. There are going to be workers who used to work in the hat industry. They're not needed anymore because we're not buying as many hats. There are going to be trucks that used to ship hats across the country. Well, we don't need to use them for that purpose. So laborers and trucks and all these things are released for use. And guess where they can be used now? In the longer-term production processes that have just been begun. So it's precisely this releasing of resources down at the bottom of the production structure that provides the material wherewithal to see through to completion all these new projects that are long-term. So again, there's a smooth coordination that occurs. That's why we call this the good scenario. All right, now we sort of put our devil horns on and think about the bad scenario. In the bad scenario, let's say interest rates come down, just like in the good one, but this time, interest rates have come down not because the public has saved more, but because some unnamed institution has pushed them down artificially. Now, I don't want to spoil this for you, so I'm going to leave that out for now. But let's say there's some institution in society that has the power to fiddle with interest rates, and they push them down artificially. Well, in this case, now what happens in this scenario number two? Well, the first thing that happens is businesses, once again, well, interest rates are low. Now's the time for long-term production. But here's the problem. Consumers are not saving more in this case. The interest rates aren't low because consumers are saving. Interest rates are low because some guy wanted them to be low. So now we have this problem that consumers are demanding more of existing products now, while a lot of these production processes are geared toward long-term product development of new products. So there's a mismatch between consumer demand and what productive forces are engaged in doing. But secondly, if we're not saving more, the consumer goods industries aren't releasing trucks and laborers, and they're not releasing resources. So a lot of these long-term production processes are going to get started, and look, trucks don't just fall from the moon, and laborers and all the raw materials and everything. And they're going to find that, wait a minute, the things we need to make these production processes work are in shorter supply than we thought. They're not actually being released for use. The lower order stages of production still want to use them. So if the higher order stages are going to get control of them, they've got to bid their prices higher. And so now you get a tug of war within the production structure over an unchanged supply of resources. Whereas before we had a smooth movement of resources from one sector to the other. Now that both sectors, we're trying to increase consumption and investment at the same time with the same unchanged amount of resources. Can't be done. And so this is ultimately what the bust is. This is when it turns out that a lot of these newly undertaken projects can't in fact be sustained. The economy has overheated, it's become over-ambitious. It has tried to engage in a combination of production projects that is incompatible with the amount of resources available in the economy. And this is the answer to the where does the cluster of error come from question. The cluster of error comes because of the interference with interest rates. Interest rates are supposed to tell something to entrepreneurs. They're not just arbitrary numbers you can fiddle with. They're not being allowed to tell the truth. They're supposed to be putting the brakes on certain things. They're supposed to be giving you a red light for certain projects, But and now I will give it away that it's the Federal Reserve System or central bank that artificially pushes the interest rates down. When they do that, what the Federal Reserve is doing is making all those lights turn green. It's green for consumers, it's green for investors, it's green for everybody. Just go, go, go. And the result is that the economy simply cannot do all these things. The higher order stages, a lot of these newly begun projects go bust, and then you have the pain of the recession. Now, I do want to just briefly give you, and again, forgive me for those of you who spend your days watching YouTube. I know I've used this metaphor before, but it's so useful. We can never hear this often enough. Mises, in chapter 20 of Human Action, and only because I've been reading it recently, I hadn't memorized the chapters, but chapter 20 of his major treatise, one of his major treatises, he says, now, if you have trouble understanding what I'm saying about the business cycle, let's just imagine an economy with one guy, to make it as simple as possible. One guy doing one thing. So let's imagine the entire economy consists of one person building one house with a supply of bricks and other building materials. But the entire economy consists of him and his project. There are no other resources by definition. This is the whole economy is him and the resources he has. Now let's suppose you get this guy, he's got a blueprint for a house, he starts building it. And what he doesn't know is that he needs 20% more bricks than he actually has if he's actually going to finish the house in that blueprint. He doesn't know this. So he's happily building and building. And of course, if he keeps on building, he's going to get to a point where he's going to say, I can't finish this stinking project, I don't have enough bricks. So obviously it would be better for him to discover his error sooner rather than later. Because the sooner he discovers it, the less waste will have occurred. He won't have laid 58 rows of bricks. He might have laid 2 rows of bricks, and then he realized, wait a minute, I don't have enough for this project. I better go back and modify the blueprint, and then just start over on another foundation, basically. And then, it's not the end of the world. But what if he's putting the last brick on, and then he looks under the tarp, and all the bricks are gone? Then it's kind of a shame for him, because then he has to demolish the whole house. He's wasted all his time and all those resources. It's all squandered. Well, that's exactly what's going on, Mises says, in an economy that is so-called stimulated by artificially low interest rates. The whole economy in the aggregate is like that master builder who is overambitious, who is trying to do things that resource availability won't allow him to do. And ultimately, when the recession comes, that is akin to the master builder saying, wait a minute, I can't do this house. I'm going to have to figure out what I should be doing instead. I'm going to have to rethink this whole plan. Maybe I can't even build a house. He's going to start over. He's going to do like a Control-Alt-Delete on his whole approach. And well, that is in fact what happens with the economy. After the bust comes, people have to figure out, all right, well, which ones are the projects that we shouldn't have been working on? And we've got to stop those, and we have to build up the projects that we have artificially starved for resources because we diverted them into all these silly bubble projects.